Thank you so much. So very good morning, Professor Appadurai and Professor Brian. And a very good evening to my Kerala friends and the friends in India, especially Dr. Mahmood. Dr. Wahid is also present, and the students from Department of Arabic and Islamic History, Department of English, Department of History, Department of Economics and Political Science. They are assembled in the conference hall, and the conference is screened there. And as part of iShore Confluences 2023, we are blessed indeed to host this conference in a virtual mode in MES Mampad College Autonomous, which is situated in the northeast of Kerala. That is the southern part of India also. And the conference title is Flows and Forms, Navigating the Changing Landscape of Global Circulation. And the speaker of the virtual session is Dr. Arjun Appadurai. And Arjun Appadurai is a world-renowned expert on the cultural dynamics of globalization, having authored numerous books and scholarly articles. And I have gone through certain books like Failure and the Future of Cultural Fact. Indeed, I have gone through that, how this globalization affected inclusivity and equity of the people. And he had a lot of research in the urban slum of Mumbai region. And on behalf of MES Mampad College, and with all due respect, I welcome Dr. Appadurai to this iShore Confluences 2023, co-hosted by MES Mampad College, Kerala. And the discussant of this virtual discussion is Brian T. Edwards. He's a Dean and Professor of School of Liberal Arts, Tulane University, New Orleans, Louisiana. And I could see from his biodata that he oversees 35 departments, like it's more than a college like me. We offer only 32 programs in our college. And he also, I gone through, his subject of interest, and I could see very interesting facts. Like he examines intersections between culture and politics, and the ways in which contemporary American culture circulate globally. Of course, I could see even my daughters, watching cartoons, movies of, American kind of, and she used to imitate, American food and American type of, pronunciation she used to have. That's the way the culture circulate. So on behalf of MES Mampad College and on behalf of iShore Confluences 2023, I welcome Professor Brian T. Edwards. And also I express my deepest gratitude to iShore 2023, and on behalf of it, Dr. Mahmood is present here on behalf of the conference. As it's a part of formality, I welcome Dr. Mahmood, and also Dr. Wahid is present in this conference, and he's the person organizers to happen and to be hosted by MES Mampad Autonomous College. And I welcome Dr. Wahid, and I welcome all the department heads, Department of Arabic, Department of English, Department of History, and Department of Economics, and all the students and scholars. There are research scholars also attending this program. I welcome all of you to this program. And the program is moderated by Professor Divya Kannan from Shiv Nadar University, India. I also extend a warm welcome you, ma'am. Once again, a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you. Have a nice evening and have a nice morning there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manzur Ali. I am Dr. Divya Kannan. I'm at the Department of History and Archaeology at Shiv Nadar University in Greater Noida. And I'm today here as the treasurer of iShore. And therefore, on behalf of iShore and all my colleagues and members of the executive committee, I extend a warm welcome to the collaborators from Mampad College, but in particular to our chair, Professor Brian Edwards from Tulane University, and distinguished scholar, Professor Arjun Appadurai from the United States of America. I have a very trivial job today, which is that of moderation. Just to lay down the housekeeping rules, we will have Professor Appadurai speak to us for almost 45 minutes. followed by any comments and thoughts from Professor Edwards for 15 minutes. And then the floor is open to a question answer session. Please feel free to use the virtual hand raising sign, or you may add your questions and comments on the chat box. We will do our best to take all questions, but we would like to keep time because it is, after all, a Friday evening and we don't want to hold people up. So we will try to wrap it up on time, and we request all of you to mute your videos and to keep your questions brief. Before I hand over to Professor Appadurai, just a few words about iShore. We are incidentally called an Institute for Social Sciences, Humanities and Oceanic Research, and we hope to be an institute in the future. But as of now, we are a network of scholars who are based across the world, particularly in various parts of South Asia. And our main interest is on expanding research on South India, particularly with a view to understanding Indian Ocean and its circulatory networks. We are also beneficiaries of various kinds of educational privileges over our own career trajectories, and we felt that we should come together to encourage younger students and scholars in the state of Kerala, which unfortunately has not seen the kind of excellence in humanities that you often find in the bigger cities in India, particularly New Delhi and parts of West Bengal. So with that pedagogical aim, but also a larger social aim to bring together students from Kerala face-to-face with well-known scholars, we begin this session. You are free to check our website online, and we encourage students to keep track of our other events. So over to you, Professor Appadurai, and 40 to 45 minutes. I'll just put in a chat message to warn you about the time, if that's okay, and
Yes.
hand it over to Professor Edwards. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope I'm audible and visible. So let me thank everyone who has spoken so far, to the principal of the college, Mampad College, MES College, Dr. Manzur Ali, to my friend who is my link to this event and to this organization, Mahmood Kuria, and to Divya Kannan for doing the necessary, sometimes thankless job, but still very important to keep everybody organized and on track. And I will try to be alert to that. So I will follow the chat. So maybe 5 minutes before my time is up, if you send me a little message or some hand wave or something, I'll know. But I'm also following my own watch. But I can only these days do one thing, maximum two at a time, so that the watch becomes the third. It may fall out of my sight, but so please do flag when my time is running out. So in my abstract, which I circulated, I flagged the content of what I hope to speak about today, which is the change that has occurred, at least in the milieu in which I operate, in the course of my 40 or 40 plus years as an academic. I guess it's approaching 50 now. And there have been noteworthy changes, and many of them are actually quite salient, I think, to the interests of iShore, and I hope, therefore, of my colleagues in iShore, and at least some people in the audience, I think, will recognize a lot of the history that I'm talking about. Otherwise, consider the historical parts of my talk, that is about the academic history, as a kind of forced diet having to do with earlier moments in scholarship on South Asia, oceanic processes, on global processes, and so on. So I have a series of points, and it's not a single lecture, but a series of recollections, notes, and observations. So here's the first one. That in the critical, historical, and social sciences, there is inevitably a tendency to push the pendulum to one extreme or another of any issue. So it is with water and land. In the great tradition of land-based histories, of which there are many, we can count Owen Lattimore's work on frontiers in the Mongol world, Frederick Jackson Turner on the role of the frontier in American history, which kind of stops in the Californian landmass and doesn't peek into the ocean, so far as I know. The connection of African internal systems of slavery in supporting the transatlantic slave trade associated with a number of scholars, not a single name. The great medieval scholar Ibn Khaldun on dynastic circles in the Islamic world, along with numerous other things he talked about, but it was essentially a land-based approach to history. And there are other examples. On the side of waters and oceans, again, there are many, many people, but we can count as kind of key figures for our times. Brodel on the Mediterranean, Bernard Bailyn on Atlantic history, the slightly lesser known J.W. Davidson on Pacific history, and yet others, all of whom periodically drew our attention to the role of water in human history. A good marker of the latest swing of the pendulum to oceanic history is marked by the Cambridge University Press series on oceanic histories edited by Armitage, Bashford, and Sivasundaram, which we might say leaves no wave unturned in its heralding of the latest liquid turn in historical studies. So, of course, we could name probably 50 other works of the last decade, but I say that that's already when Cambridge University Press, has a series, something is been certified as well. But this is just a reminder that we've had this pendulum for quite a long time. And probably those of you who know better intellectual history, either from South Asia or from the West or from elsewhere in the world, the swinging has probably been going on from one place in the pendulum to the other for much longer than the 20th century. But I'm telling the history of my exposure in grad school and so on. So it's foreshortened. It doesn't try and tell a deep time story of this pendulum. So now I shift to my own work and a little bit of my own direct engagement with these subjects, bearing in mind that there is a pendulum between these kinds of interests, that much of the resistance, this is my next point, I faced to my early work on global flows, I now realize was coming from those from scholars generally tied to a terra-centric view of world systems. And in my abstract, I referred to people like Wallerstein, Gunder Frank, Janet Abu-Lughod, and many others, that if you look back at their work, you will see, apart from all the fine points and great contributions and elaborate debates that they launched, generally speaking, they were on land. There was every now and then an awareness that you had to get by and through and past oceans to get to the next landed place. But the perspective, I would say, was terra-centric. So this bias has an old history and is a natural artifact of interest in land-based empires and states, factories and plantations, crops and goods. These were the focus of most approaches to translocal studies. But on all sides of this debate, there was a tendency, whether people had the land perspective, which has generally been the dominant one, or went to the other side or drifted towards the ocean side in terms and the water side, there was a tendency, which I now see clearly, to see geographies, whether of water, of land, or of both, as preconditioning, even determining histories. A bias that runs all the way, you might say, from someone like Brodel, all the way up to someone very different like Samuel Huntington on the Clash of Civilizations. That is a geographically determined view of cultural styles, civilizational forms, and therefore the clash that he so vividly but wrongly identified. This tacit geographical determinism, I say tacit because sometimes it's open and direct, but very often it's tacit, often veered into Orientalist and racist stereotypes that were hard to contextualize in the field that I was born into, which is we call area studies. So area studies, you notice, is a term which is a bit ambiguous as to whether it's land or water. It's a whole part of the map, which may actually often be marked by water, crisscrossed by water, and so on, but everything's in when you speak of an area in whatever the operational idiom of area studies was, whether it was large world regions, smaller ones, where they got refined. It's a whole topic in its own right, how area studies shaped its objects, and then therefore determined itself as a field of, or a discipline or a style of inquiry. So having grown up in that paradigm, namely area studies, where, for example, the term South Asia arrives, still in tension with India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. South Asia is this other entity which was born in that time, and lots of people have written very thoughtfully about the birth of that particular geography after World War II, especially in the US. I won't spend much time on that. So the question for me is how to relate as an area studies person to this drift towards geographical determinism that was always around, whether people had a water orientation, a land orientation, or a mixed orientation. And in my case, it took the form of trying to see how to engage with the new interests in globalization that began in the very late 80s and the early 90s. And I was certainly one of those who early on saw that the term globalization out there was somehow more appropriate than, say, transnational, translocal, et cetera, which were in play, say, even in the 80s. So the question was, how does area studies fit in this world? And a local issue, again, a kind of footnote about which maybe we can talk later, is that in the US, it is now forgotten that the minute the Berlin Wall came down as a kind of big icon of a new era, in the world and in how to study it, area studies became a bit of a black sheep or a stalking horse, or whatever the right metaphor is. It became seen as the specialty of people with a too narrow view, whereas we needed to be global in our perspective. And I, having made a heavy investment in my training and my mentors and so on, in some version of area studies, but also finding myself a canary in the mine of the new globalization studies, somehow wanted to eat my cake and have it too. That is to somehow say, these are not fundamentally processes at odds. And when I was struggling with that effort, which has a certain dated quality about it. I mean, nobody today is worrying about various area studies. Either people don't do either, or they do both, or they don't worry about it anyway, as much as in the 90s. The one solution I came up with was an idea that I want to speak about now, and brings me into another aspect of my talk, is an idea that I wrote about starting almost 2 decades ago, which is the following: to resist the idea of this tendency towards geographical determinism, which also had its place in area studies, because people vested in the Middle East, there's that, China studies and so on, had a slight tendency always to make their objects of study eternal objects, somehow, as opposed to somehow artifactual. so my idea, I had two actually. One was the idea that histories make geographies, which is a slogan I've trotted out periodically in my written work and in my talks. So some of you may be familiar, indeed even fed up with it, but I have to return to it because I think it still has some juice, which is to say it allows one to think, whether one is thinking from a land or a water perspective, that histories, that is dynamic, agentive, human actions, are what actually shape geographies. So there is no geography as such. However liquid, fluid, or solid it might be, however hot or cold it might be, wet or dry it might be, terrestrial, or as we say today, planetary it might be, it is rendered into geography by historical action. And by this, I mean something more than the standard constructivist argument that geographies are constructed, so to speak, by human cognitive interests. I mean by human actions as a whole. Empires, pilgrimages, all kinds of flows, religious conversions, physical efforts to extract goods and move them to different places. These are all massive forms of human action that have been going on for a very long time, and long even before we have good records. So really, it's a very old thing. But every time those big actions occurred, sometimes on a very small scale and sometimes on a very large scale, geographies were sedimented, catalyzed, produced, labeled. So the great work by a wonderful writer and scholar whose first name I think was Paul, I forget the last name, on Botany Bay. So that whole geography of Australia is part of a history of discovery and also of technonomy, of naming places and this and that. It's fascinating. That you can do anywhere and everywhere fruitfully. But the naming business is itself the point of the spear of big mercantile, political, and other processes. So in a way, what I was doing by saying histories make geographies is actually saying something more or less self-evident, except that a lot of other scholarship tended to drift into the other direction and see fixities at the bottom of which were often, as with Montesquieu and so on, climate, sort of geographical, environmental things that were outside human action, which then somehow, either directly or indirectly, shaped what we think of as cultures, regions, countries, etc. But the truth is, it's always action that produces those things and action that changes those things. So the geographies keep changing, and that is a historical. You can't reverse that and say the same is true of geography and history. What is true is that geographies change, and that is because the engine there is history, historical action, historical agents, historical force. You can't reverse it and avoid serious mistakes, stereotypes, etc. The other idea I had at that time, and this was in the 90s at the University of Chicago, in keeping with my general interest in the area studies versus globalization interests, the idea that histories produce geographies, also the idea that modernity is not the monopoly of the West, that it is in fact both mobile and multiple. All these things became little industries of their own, multiple modernities, alternative modernities. There was a huge amount of stuff, but the essential idea was it's not fruitful to see modernity as a single arrow, which then other people are lucky to also become part of, arrow of time. So idea I had, and we had a project at the University of Chicago, which I would say was pretty prescient, a collective project, which we called Regional Worlds. And its premise was equally simple. The premise was everywhere in the world, people have a picture of the whole world, not just of themselves, not just of their neighbors, but of the entire world. And that picture may be cosmological, it may be extremely empirical, but it's always there. And we can tell and write this history, in its own right for different locations, for different localities and so on. But in our world, the time of globalization, it is obvious that almost everybody has a fairly complex picture of what the world is, how it turns, what it means. So recently, some of you may have seen that Prime Minister Modi had a tumultuous welcome, not just in Australia, which is understandable, but in Papua New Guinea, which for anthropologists is the land of highland groups and kinship and, this and that, which is all fine. It's also deeply involved with the world. So how many people have an idea what is the general debate about the world in Papua New Guinea? Well, there is one. And it would behoove us to understand what it is and to, in principle, be aware that all regions, and I use region now as a stand-in for locality, nation, neighborhood even, has its world. So you might say from that point of view that globalization is a negotiation between those regional worlds. So already the problem is a second order or third order problem. And in the 90s, these two principles were part of my own effort to get past the pendular option between land and water and the tendency towards a kind of techno-geographical way of writing history. So the final idea I'll speak about, I just want to ask Divya. Divya, how am I doing? Maybe I'll look at my chat. Just give me 1 second to see where I am. Time I have left, so I can time the remainder of what I have to say. 15 minutes.
You're about 27 minutes in, 25 minutes in. Yeah. Is that right? 20 minutes in. Is that right, Divya?
So I have about 20 or 25 to go. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. So let me turn to, in effect, the second half of my talk. So I think that, the timing is good. I appreciate that. Misbehaving. Okay. So another idea that I proposed, and this is all in the context of, please remember, I was also on the land side in my training. The whole interest in water of the last, say, 10 to 15 years, but noticeably the last 5 or 8, well after my initial training and my early scholarly career. So it's something I've learned a lot from, but I'm not occupying it, directly or actively. That said, I think some of the things that I was struggling with and I tried to formulate, such as the idea of regional worlds or histories producing geographies, and yet one more that I'm about to put on the table, are I hope, useful for people thinking with water, much more than I ever was trained to do in my career. And this idea, which comes out of the interest in flows, and recognizes that flows also have obstacles, that they run into bumps and frictions and so on. So my colleague Anna Singh has for a lifetime talked about friction, which is certainly a good thing to remember. And I agree with that. But what that set of questions about flows, frictions, obstacles, bumps, and I was the object of a lot of criticism for what was seen as a kind of pastoral hymn to flow, as if there were no obstacles, no nations, no borders, no passports. I don't know quite how people read this into my work, but I have to tell you, the reader, like the customer, is king. So if they say it, it must be true. So I've begun to pay much more attention to that in the last 15, 20 years or so. But one idea I came up with in thinking about that tension between flows and things that slow or impede flow is that we need a model of circulation, which is what all these flows, both terrestrial and oceanic or water-driven, in both instances, we need to connect the, here's the phrase I used, the forms of circulation to the circulation of forms. So in a way, in other words, we need to look at forms, I would say more precisely today, forms that circulate, and then the paths or grooves on which they circulate, which also then often present soft and hard spots, bumps, shear walls, and so on and so on. So we need to, that's what in our older vocabulary we call the circuits. But then there are the things themselves, and the things themselves I try to upgrade from commodities, which have quiddity, you can touch them, feel them, eat them, smell them, to forms. And by forms, I meant forms of marriage, forms of politics, forms like democracy, all those things which are not simple quiddities, but also move around. Nationalism, for example, famously with Ben Anderson, there is a moving form. And an excellent example, I would say, of the circulation of forms, especially for me as an anthropologist, comes from our colleague Mahmoud Kuria's own work on the circulation of matrilineal forms across different parts of the Indian Ocean littoral, and his work with other scholars that shows that matriarchal and patriarchal forms coexisted in productive friction in the early centuries of Islam, from Mozambique to Minangkabau. So you could look at that from the point of view of forms of circulation of forms, which I'm about to do. But if you just go to my earlier observations, you would also see this as the way in which histories produce geographies. In this case, a geography from Mozambique to Minangkabau, which is not on every map as a significant geography, but it's a geography as real as any. And likewise, the fact that there are regional worlds is also clear in this world of moving matrilineal and patrilineal forms, which is within one frame, that is, say, Islam, and maritime commerce. So you might say here that the form of circulation here, the form, the circuit, is oceanic trade, and the circulating form is matrilineal. So you could multiply this by saying that this example could be fruitfully pursued, meaning the circuit of circulation and the actual form which circulates for other issues, such as ocean-based slave trade in the Atlantic and the circulation of African religious forms, for example, to Brazil. So those are forms that are circulating while the trade is going on in slavery, in slaves and other commodities. The trade in Oriental carpets, for example, another example, with the circulation of Islamic visual and aesthetic forms. The 18th century trade between Europe and Asia, which brought new forms of marine insurance into tension with new struggles between merchants and the colonial state. So this has been touched on by, again, a whole number of people. I note, for example, Lakshmi Subramaniam, whose work is well known to many of you, but many others have also worked on earlier periods on Europe. The insurance story is very important, but the idea that insurance is a circulating form, which itself creates and reacts to circuits of circulation, I don't think is so familiar, but I think it could be very useful. In all these cases, forms circulate, and they also shape the forms, routes, modes, tools of circulation for the circuits. This is, you might say, this tension or relationship between the circulation of forms and the forms or circuits of circulation is another way to understand how histories shape geography. So rather than just being a simple thing, men make their own geography, even if not exactly as they please, you can say this is a slightly more business class version of that idea, which you can get if you add enough frequent flyer miles, you can get to this, which is what are the forms circulating in anything you study, you can ask that question. So even if you take the simplest things like coffee, like tea, and so on, which are like salt, like pepper, the famous pepper, the one that dominates whole libraries by the scholarship on it, you could ask what are the forms, sensory forms, for example, taste, smell. How do these circulate? Do they first go ahead like scouts and then the trade follows, or the trade somehow happens contingently and then the sensorium changes? These are wonderful questions and I haven't seen them yet directly addressed. So these are just stray observations. So I can also see now how I would have benefited from earlier knowledge. This is a slight shift now, of the new philosophies of agency, animation, being, and vitality that fall under the rubric of the post-human turn. I personally argue in a collection that many of you know from 1986, that is before Christ, that objects could be regarded as having social lives, but I did not see. It took many much wiser people to draw my attention to the fact that what I did not see was that this insight could be ontological, not just methodological. So in other words, there's always much to learn. And my own case tells you it's never too late to understand that it's not enough to say, let's treat objects as if they have a life, a biography, etc. Along came Latour and others said, you know what? They actually do. Of course, there are still many who wonder exactly what that means, exactly what it means to have a parliament of things, exactly what it means to have democracy among all sorts of agents, including dust and clouds and humans and so on. It's not entirely clear, but it's a move forward that we have to take up. So, and as you learn things, you can put earlier discoveries, at least I discover, or I learned, in a new perspective. Again, I talk a little bit about my own history to illustrate this. In my case, my first scholarly publication was in the year 1974, and it is justly obscure. That is why I give it a small promotional now. In the journal, which many of you know, Indian Economic and Social History Review, and it was on a subject which some of you may truly have never heard of, and I'm happy to bring it up again, so to speak, which is a formation called right and left-hand castes, which ran throughout South India for about 6 centuries until colonial rule, and now it simply doesn't exist. It's not worthy of attention, but it was a big thing. So I did a paper on what could this thing, which is in fact a form, because it's a contrast between 2 sets of castes. So anyway, all this I can retro-engineer, but just let's say that was my first article. And I bring it up because it was wholly based on the remarkable South Asia holdings at the Regenstein Library of the University of Chicago. This research exercise, and I just want to use it as a little lesson in how one learns and how one relearns, led me to remarkable sources that many of you in this audience will know, like Fawcett's 13-volume study of the English factories in India, by which is meant 17th century factories, not the factories today turning out microchips near Bangalore or whatever else they do. This is 17th century with words like factor did not have a mathematical meaning. It meant a certain kind of person who did something in the factory, but that's another story. But these were great collections. I learned to understand, to read them, first of all, in the library, 13 volumes, on 17th century coastal British commercial enterprises on the Coromandel coast. You might say an arcane interest, if ever there was any. I learned to read them a little better because my guru, my most important teacher, the late Professor Barney Cohn, exposed his students to the work of, and I just give a few names, there were many, Michael Pearson, Tapan Rai Chaudhary, K.N. Chaudhary, Rhodes Murphy, and others who transformed our understanding of ports, trade, manufacture, and conquest in the early modern world. Also, and I mentioned some of these names because they're so relevant even today. So to Brian, I say, for example, when you told me about your current work, I immediately thought of Rhodes Murphy and port cities. Very old work, but somehow a pioneer in its way and in its time. Also in my PhD research, also now shrouded in the mists of some pre-literate past, I worked on temples in South India. Again, there are people in this audience who have some awareness of it, but I can assure you, for the bulk of the people who read my work, my life, career, even perhaps my birth is in 1986, Social Life of Things, 1996, Modern Age. But I was a laborer in the fields of the archive and of very obscure works and scholarship before then. And in the work on temples, I read every available work of a dear friend, also now no longer with us, Burton Stein, whose work many of you will know, the most influential historian, in my view, of pre-colonial South India in his time. This work, that is Stein's work, also allowed me to catch a glimpse of the Coromandel trade originating in the great merchant associations of South India. They were called Mahanadas. Still, in spite of all these temptations, in spite of working in my vision somehow ended at the land boundaries of Fort St. George, or if I was reading about the factory in Masulipatam, Kadalur, Nagapatnam, all land places, but I never looked out far beyond them. I was too timid, so to speak, to put my toes into the water. Thus, here's my conclusion, I will stop. Learning, I can say, and this is directed to the younger scholars here in the hope that it might be of some interest and some value to them. There's nothing deep or data-driven about it, so to speak. Learning is often relearning, since in my experience, almost no one ever encounters a source, a theory, or a method for the first time. In other words, unlike the astronauts excites me as much today for this reason as it did 50 years ago. And I know that that kind of impulse is what animates this iSure network. And I thank you for asking me to give this talk, for listening to me. And now I very much look forward to what Brian and others in the audience may have to comment or say or ask. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Appadurai, for making my job easier and for some great provocation about being less timid and foraying into the waters. Thank you, Professor Edwards. You have up to 15 minutes because we are on time, and after which we will open the floor to question and answers.
Well, first of all, thank you, Divya, for as treasurer and as moderator for your work. And I laughed, Arjun, when you said you could do two things, but not three things at a time. Someone who's done so much for so long, but I recognize that when you're giving a talk on Zoom. I wanted to thank also Mahmoud Koria for inviting me, and Arjun for recommending me, and Dr. Manzur Ali, and for introducing this, and the students whom we saw for a moment sitting very nicely in MES Mampad College, which it's nice when you're in these abstract Zoom spaces to actually see people out there. But it's Arjun, I think many times when in these very interesting moments when we have multi-time zone, multi-sided lectures, that we are continually living in a world that you helped us understand. And the disjunctures and differences that you've been teaching us about for decades really become apparent at these moments where we could somehow come together in Kerala, where many people are in Berlin, where you are, in New Orleans, where I am, and finally the sun has risen. But it does remind me of a talk I gave in Hyderabad back in the mid 2000s, around 2005, when the speaker was who was welcoming me spoke about the moments in Chicago where I lived at that point. And I think actually, Arjun, you were still living in Chicago, and spoke about hospitals in Chicago in the middle of the night sending X-rays digitally to Hyderabad to be read because it was quicker to send them to Hyderabad than to go down a few floors in a hospital in Chicago. So these moments that we're now living in somehow, not without disjuncture, not without the moments when the signal breaks for a moment, or I saw Mahmoud saying that the monsoon's schedule is messing up his internet connection, are somehow naturalized for us, but always a part of the world that we recognize, and all across the generations that are here in the room. Arjun, I really, it's a great honor to listen to you and to think with you about this remarkable career and set of trajectories and ways that your thinking has developed over the decades, because you have framed for so many of us and in so many different disciplines ways of understanding our object itself, as well as the disciplinary frameworks through which we often have tried to grasp those objects. And the fact that your work, and again, I did know, for me, the massive influence of Social Life of Things from 1986, this collection that was so groundbreaking, but the introduction of which is a book in itself and setting a paradigm for thinking that had massive influence. I did have a sense that it didn't begin there, of course, but so I appreciate the references to before. But I just want to say a couple of things and how that Miss May for students. I have to say I've always found it incredibly inspiring to speak to students, both in South India and in different parts of the Middle East, North Africa. Also, area studies that we deconstruct from the very start, which we'll say. But the imagination, what Arjun has called influentially the research imagination of how it is we approach the work that we're doing. And so when I see students in a room listening to great scholars such as Professor Appadurai, I'm always struck by the imagination that you may be having in your listening moment, in your auditory moment, of the things that interest you in your world or in the world that you see around you, that may not be taken seriously, perhaps, by your professors, even today when we take so much seriously, and how to kind of gather and bring together not only the scholarly and theoretical tools, let's say, but how to fuse those with the imagination that you as a student or as a young scholar or as a scholar at any point grasps onto and takes with it as an object in itself. Just to mention a couple of highlights on what Professor Appadurai has mentioned and in his career. Those of us, so I was an undergraduate in the late 1980s when the Berlin Wall fell, and then a PhD student in the 90s, trying to understand my own topic. My PhD was in American studies, talk about an area study. But recognizing that the two fields that my own work has intersected with, American studies and Middle East studies, both of which emerged as so-called area studies at historical moments of within world history, when the United States in the 1940s sees itself all of a sudden as rising as a global power, and recognizing that it doesn't have the scholarly or disciplinary formations either to understand itself, and a field called American Studies, which is really brought together by scholars trying to understand the United States by American scholars from a variety of disciplines, primarily history, literature, sociology, the major fields in it. And at the same time, groups of American scholars, then funded by the US government, trying to understand, in that vague, problematic word, comprehend, which means both to understand, but also to somehow to try to contain in a sort of colonial way, other parts of the world, other areas, right? And interesting always to me is how the people or the scholars or the students who populate those different disciplinary formations don't speak to one another. So as supposedly solid disciplinary forms or solid area studies or parts of the world that should be solid, and I love the word terracentric that Professor Appadurai is using as a way of casting generations of scholars who didn't quite know what to do with the model of flows or oceans or the parts in between the borders, so to speak, if you shift the map slightly, but try to find definitions that would encapsulate them or somehow contain them. So I have on my wall here a map of New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, which, as you may know, is one of the southernmost cities on the Gulf of Mexico here in the United States. And it shows the parts of New Orleans that were underwater during, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, 2005. And it's a very interesting map because for people who lived here in 2005, it's traumatic to look at this. They see their neighborhoods underwater. I mean, it's shaded and it's a very strange map of land with a river and a lake, but then shades of places that are most of the time land. But when it rains very hard, as it does here at this time of year for many months, such as similar to South India, will go underwater for hours or not. And this idea that that the land is also marked by what will be underwater, right? We are losing here in the South Louisiana a football field or a soccer pitch or football pitch every few hours here goes underwater because of the way the landscape is changing. It's very dramatic, the effects of global climate change here. But back to just to comment on Professor Appadurai's own comments on his work, when after the social life of things, which is such a massive influence on us and such a crucial turn, as he says in that work, turns the story of commodities on its head, turning the work of Marx on his head and teaching us to see that as if Marx had taught us that the commodity kind of bore with it something of its production, the fetishistic quality of the commodity, was somehow the embedded alienated labor that had been at the start. When Professor Appadurai teaches us to turn that around and to see the commodity as a thing that will have its own social life and to look at the reception or the movement, that is such a dramatic shift for us that leads to not only this understanding of flows, but as you say, like what will later be called the research imagination, the idea that objects or forms or popular culture or temples or any of the right hand, left hand cast, I mean, any of these different sorts of social forms can be understood then flipped around, as it were, right? That word things, he's being very modest when he says he didn't realize that things could be ontological, it was just methodological. I don't completely believe that because I see it embedded in his work in 1986. But that word things becomes enormously important to so many scholars, and even the attention to the word thing, which, as you know, in English usage is often the word that people used when they couldn't think of another word to put in its place. I'm always interested in words in different languages that kind of are placeholders, but to take the attention to that word, and then there becomes books, and journal articles, critical inquiry, things that focus on the word thing or attention in literature. Second, to say quickly, when the Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and the scholarship and that the work that Professor Appadurai had already done, but was doing then with his massively important essay, Difference and Disjuncture in the Global Cultural Economy, which comes out right at that moment, 1990, and then becomes the centerpiece to the book Modernity at Large that comes out in 1996. Really opens for so many of us a way to think about what not only the flows and the transnational approach to thinking of fields of study that were previously located so closely around the nation or the national, but also to focus on this word difference and disjuncture, the disruptive moment, the moment that doesn't quite fit in. And I find this not only in the way that it's described in his work to be generative, but also, again, I want to come back to the research imagination. How can this work help you as a young scholar or as a student thinking about your own trajectory, to notice those moments of disjuncture, the thing that doesn't quite fit in? It actually connects to the long tradition, I would say, of cultural anthropology in this moment, and I found this to be actually just a tactic, let's call it a research tactic, when, and I'll tell a story in a moment, when one is doing one set of, goes to a place to do research, looking for one thing, one topic that you think is your project, and recognizing in the field, as it were, or at the site, I'm not talking about archival work, but it could work for archives, that something doesn't quite fit in, right? The famous story, in Clifford Geertz's work, for example, notes on a Balinese cockfight when he and his wife Hildred Geertz were looking to study one thing and ended up being swept away by a crowd and recognizing that the real topic was a cockfight, and it becomes a way of opening up for that major anthropologist a whole field of understanding, right? But this can happen to any of us, right? Where we think we have one topic learned from afar, and then we go start to research, and the disjuncture, the moment that doesn't quite fit in, is the interesting one. This happened to me in my own research in Tehran, Iran, for my most recent book, which is called After the American Century, which is the ends of culture in the Middle East, some of which appeared in Public Culture, a little snippet of which, when I thought I was going to Iran to recognize the ways that cinematic forms flowed back and forth. I'm very deeply influenced by Professor Appadurai's work in my own imagination, but I thought it was very interesting in the case of Iran that Hollywood films were tremendously popular in Iran. The forms, as well as the actual films themselves in pirated copies and so on, just at the moment when the political situation, of course, had never been good between the US and Iran. So I was interested in cinematic flows, and in the other direction, that some of the most important Iranian art film directors, such as Abbas Kiarostami or Jafar Panahi, or some of these very famous Mohsen Makhmadov, were internationally famous in the other direction. So anyway, I went to Iran looking for something about the way cinema was flowing between the two countries. And what did I find in Tehran, walking around, being escorted by graduate students trying to show me things, was a tremendous fascination with Shrek, the film, the CGI film cartoon Shrek. So everywhere I saw Shrek, little sculptures on the street with these DVDs, whole shops dedicated to pirated films, and that became the disjuncture moment. It ended up opening up something different about what was actually happening, right? So I won't go on with that story. It's been published as Watching Shrek in Tehran, and it became circulated quite well because it became a way to talk about something else that was happening alongside the larger topics, right? So a research imagination, the other two things I want to mention in Appadurai's career, because I want to keep the time, which was to open this up since I'm wrapping to an end, is what in this wonderful collection called Globalization, I have them all, but I'm showing one here, that Appadurai calls grassroots globalization and trying to open up the research imagination. It's this alongside the creation of the great journal Public Culture, which has helped and been the space for understanding transnational movements of culture, but really opening up the imagination of what it means to focus on the form itself. So for 20 or 30 seconds, I'll say that you made reference to the focus on ports and global port cities, which is a project that I'm working on now with partners. Really, it's a research partnership with scholars and artists, urban planners and activists, community organizers located in port cities, especially in the global South, or as we were saying before, even the North has a South. So in New Orleans, this is very much a South in a certain way. But what we find and what we are inspired by as Professor Appadurai says, there's a long interest in port cities. Of course, this is not a new interest in certain ways, but that it becomes a way to think, I would say, and I'm inspired by the talk today, and it gives me a new vocabulary, how to put the terracentric and the fluid or the ocean alongside one another. Because so many, and not all, but so many of the global port cities, which we know to have certain characteristics in common with one another, they tend to be, for obvious reasons, more multilingual, more multinational. They have certain kinds of poverty and crime and environmental crisis that is common to so many of them. But they also have very wonderful positive characteristics that comes from some of those same multinational or points of connection, right? Which is to say they tend to be very creative cities. They tend to have artistic movements or everyday creativity or great culinary traditions, again, probably because of the commingling of cultures, great artists and so on. And wondering as a project whether you could actually take advantage of these sorts of positive or connector sort of networks to address some of the challenges. Let me just let me say why I think this is interesting in the context of thinking of flows. It is the case, and I'll use New Orleans as one example, that these cities, of course, are not only outward facing, not only points of connection to oceans or seas or rivers, but they also, of course, exist in some uncomfortable and sometimes contested way with their national location. So New Orleans is in the United States. It's at the end of the Mississippi River. And after Hurricane Katrina, the United States, and this place is always in danger of sinking. It really is. Every day, the streets sink a little bit more. It's very difficult. I've never been I've been in a lot of places in the world, and I've never been on bumpier roads than in New Orleans because they're always sinking, right? Creating enormous potholes and so on. But the United States Congress debated in 2005 and 2006 whether to give federal funds to keep New Orleans alive, so to speak. Did it make sense to keep it? Because there's this contested relationship to the nation. It's exceptional in some sorts of ways. It does and does not fit. This is true of many port cities, not all, that have an unusual relationship to the nation that looks backwards towards the land. So thinking of another word that's come out of Appadurai's work, the node, right? The importance of thinking of a set of connections, including Kerala, that is connected through oceans, as we know, for various centuries of reasons of trade, but also then has this sort of ambivalent relationship to the land and nation that it's a part of, gives us a different way of sort of fusing, so to speak, those different ways of thinking, and reminding us, of course, of the great importance, as Appadurai says, to bring together what is still true and valuable about area studies. All of those examples that Professor Appadurai could reference to the local audience that they would understand, those have important meanings, right? That your audience there in Kerala will understand that some of your global audience may not understand, whether it's temples, right hand, left hand, and so on. Those forms of knowledge, of course, remain of exceptional importance to us and not to be left behind by the interest in flows and oceans. So how do we bring those together? How do we bring together the sense that the terracentric still has some, or the area still has something to tell us alongside the fluids? Anyway, this work is enormously provocative, productive, Professor Appadurai, and I know I'm one of many tens and hundreds of thousands of scholars who owe you a great debt of gratitude for the ways you continue to help us think through the challenges of the worlds that we live in and we have lived in. So those are my comments. I'm really looking forward to comments from the audience, the students, and everyone. Thank you so much for the honor to speak here today with you.
Thank you, Professor Edwards. We have questions and comments coming in. If any of the individuals would like to speak up, please feel free. I'm just going to slightly intervene and maybe misuse my position as the moderator and maybe throw in a question drawing upon what Professor Edwards said. I was just wondering about the political economy of the research imagination. Post-COVID, how does one actually do the research? This is a concern that the students have. They say, yes, we understand flows, we understand circulation. We are with you on the conceptual part of it. But how do students' biggest concern remain still the questions or the pathways that they can take to actually use ocean as a method or understand flows better. And I'm wondering this aloud because while we unsettle the terra-centric landscape, it probably forces us to rethink questions of immobility as well. Post-COVID, we saw immobility was a big question for several people, as opposed to a slightly, let's say, romanticized notion of mobility. So how does one think that, and how do we really carry out this at the level of research for students who may be interested in incorporating elements of it in their research? So I'm going to start with reading out Priya Menon's question. Please feel free to open your chat. Priya is sending us greetings from Alabama, and she says, thank you very much for that illuminating talk, Professor Appadurai. As someone with interest in the literary productions influenced by these oceanic flows of commodities, could you mention some literary texts, perhaps fiction or poetry, that influenced you as you discuss the conceptual category of research imagination so powerfully? Thanks also to Professor Edwards for eloquently discussing cinematic flows apropos Iran. So we start with that question, followed by Jintu's question. Would you like to respond?
Would you, Divya, like me to say something now? Or
Yes, why don't you respond? Yes.
Sure, I'll do so briefly because there may be other things to follow up on. But maybe before I respond to your question or pair of questions and to Priya Menon's, let me begin by thanking Brian for a very wholesome and generous set of comments. I truly appreciate it. And there was a lot there, of course, that we could take off from to have a much more extended conversation, which I hope we will do at some point in some forum or format. And also to say I'm greatly impressed by how much you managed to say in your very short time, whereas I could dilate a bit more, but you packed a lot in, touching on a lot. And I just had one thing that I had on my mind, because you brought up New Orleans more than once, and it's a city I've visited, but I don't know that much about except by reading, to wonder whether you have drawn on and used the work of two colleagues, one of whom sadly passed away, Anuradha Mathur, and her husband is Dilip Dakunia. They are both regional planners and architects who've written a truly monumental book on New Orleans about 15 years ago, I think, very close to the time of the terrible trauma of New Orleans. But it was a brilliant effort to talk about the long-term slow movement of the Mississippi across the American landscape and its implication for the appearance and disappearance of land all the way down to New Orleans. And they used that to then do a brilliant book on Mumbai, which is about the city completely misunderstanding what it means to be surrounded by water and how you should be a sponge rather than build these, what were they called in New Orleans? The term leeways, something like that.
The levees, yeah.
Levees, that the army's constantly like putting a finger in the dike. Anyway, it's brilliant work, which is urban planning, design, and history, both, and comparative, because and Dilip Dakunia is still very much with us. Anuradha is sadly not, died young, but I just, something we can follow up later, but I've had this on my mind because they are so relevant to not just New Orleans, but generally to places in the monsoon world. Dilip has now written a whole book on rivers. So they are among my sort of lead inspiring thinkers in this space. That's just one quick comment. And of course, the Iran Frekiana is totally fascinating. Only to me, perhaps second to my interest in why so many people, women, particularly in Tehran, are getting nose jobs and have been for about 15 years. And even when they don't have nose surgery, have little plaster to suggest that they might have. So this, I've asked any number of people, can you cast light on rhinoplasty in Iran. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. Not trivial, but it's the telling detail problem. It's the one that doesn't quite fit with everything else. On which you were so good. So I'll shift, Brian, though there's a lot more to say in response to your thoughts. I'll shift to, I think it's Divya and Priya, right? Yeah, Priya. So Divya, first, I'll say there are two things here. One is the question of, they're kind of connected because of the mobility question. But I will say that, I've spent at least the last 20 years writing about things like fear of small numbers, construction of ethnicities, ethnocidal violence, things which are firmly not about the joys of flow. I mean, sure, there are diasporas everywhere, but that doesn't mean there aren't other things. So yes, the idea that not everybody enjoys mobility is now very familiar. We know about the terrible ways in which labor was confined during COVID. People were either extruded, which is to say forced to be mobile, kicked out of towns, sent to their villages where people didn't want them in India, or locked into their neighborhoods, their jobs, and their very difficult lives in the cities where they were. So indeed, there are endless complexities. And the truth is, that was always true. So any exaggerated statement, for example, about the Black Atlantic or this or that, has to be always put in the context of the brutality and cruelty of slavery and of other commodity traffics that had huge costs, coffee, tea, sugar, etc., without also overlooking the fact that certain things were generated in these contexts, which also still have a life. So I'm totally with you. I think we have no disagreement that not everybody is a member of the top 5% of the world's population. We are both clear on that. On the research question, I think it's a different, much trickier thing. I have students now who are stuck doing fieldwork right in the middle of COVID. And I think, COVID as a catastrophic situation is now slightly behind us, I believe, in most parts of the world. But its challenge is always there, which is a challenge of national boundaries, passports, permissions, funding. Lots of things can limit mobility. So you can't go wherever your mind takes you. That is perfectly true. But one of the great advantages of reading and of the archive, which will then take me to Priya's question, is that you can do a lot of things with what is relatively near you. So let's say if you are in northern Kerala, there's a remarkable set of archives in and around Calicut that go back to Kerala history of the last 7-8 centuries minimum. There is a huge amount of anthropological folkloric stuff which has not been fully understood, processed, or digested. There is the archives in various directions, depending on your ability to afford railway or other travel to Delhi, to Chennai, to Trivandrum. So I think, honestly, that the limits of course, it's great to have terrific funding. And these days, as you know, people from all over the world are going all over the world. So it's not just some 3 Westerners who are coming to Kerala. People are going everywhere all the time. But if you don't have that, I still think there's a lot you can do by examining your environment, the books around you. I grew up in Bombay with some in my home, maybe 30 books that included, old copies of the Reader's Digest and then equally old copies of Tamil magazine, Ananda Vigadan. I mean, there's a totally random assortment, out of which I created whole worlds. Russian folk tales. I mean, why was Russian? But that was because there were publishing houses selling Russian literature. But anyway, it's a completely bizarre menu and small. But my mind fed off all those things in a big way. So I think there are ways, but I won't say more because it's a more serious question to really look discipline by discipline. What if you really need to do field work? What's a substitute? Those I'll stay away for a moment, but they are crucial questions. On Priya Menon's question, thank you. I am more a avocational reader of literature and of fiction and of, say, poetry. So I don't have a kind of disciplined approach. It's a more random, opportunistic approach. But I would say I can think of the work of Glisson on the Caribbean and of my dear friend Mantia Diawara, who's done stuff with him. Amazing stuff that brings out that point of view as a powerful, powerful literary point of view. And on the other hand, my other also good friend, happily, Amitav Ghosh, whose work on the whole has always been brilliant about oceanic flows and processes. I'm sure others will come to mind, but I do think generally that anywhere that I have looked, including wonderful colleague at Witwatersrand, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, but who works on the printed word circulation, Indian Ocean, including literary work, but not only. So I think there's a ton of stuff where you might even say some form of fiction is richer even than the archives, which can be a bit spotty, partial, uneven, and so on. The beauty of novels and poems is they are whole works. They are presented as wholes, which then let you think that way. So I'll pause there. That's a too long answer, but let me stop and see who else would like to say something. Maybe Brian, maybe Priya, maybe Divya, or others.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. I'll move on to the next question from Jintu Alias. And the question is, do you think there is a connection between globalization, liberalism, and cosmopolitanism? Can a space be cosmopolitan without being liberal, if not global? And we do have two other questions. I can just read it out to you in case you want to.
Please,
connect.
we can combine something.
Yeah. We have a question from Labanya. I have two questions. Number one, will you talk a bit on the possible linkages between circulation and extractivism in multiple forms? And second question is, how do you see the future of the oceanic turn as a corrective to the terra-centric biases?
So those were three altogether, right?
Together, yeah.
Okay. Ryan, did you want to intervene? You've been very graciously listening to this.
I was so excited when you mentioned Amitav Ghosh's work, also not only as a literary exploration of circulation and the commodity and the thing. He clearly has been reading your work, Arjun, but also well, it also connects to the question about I think it's actually one of the other ones in the comments about extractivism and circulation. And for those who have not yet read his book, The Nutmeg's Curse, which is really thinking not only about the circulation, it's nonfiction, it's a critical essay about the circulation of spice, and nutmeg and how it connects to colonialism, but other forms. He talks about petrol and so on as a connection to circulatory matrix. But at the same time, he's writing this book during COVID, and he's worrying and he's isolated. He's unable to travel. He's stuck at a certain moment. He can't get to his mother. And it's a very moving, reflections while he's writing the most global book about flows of commodities and cultural forms of being stuck in one place, right? I mean, there haven't yet been a lot of writing about this new book of his, but it's a really interesting meditation in a sense on the question that was asked about the relation between flow and isolation, or when one cannot travel to a place. And even if you're a global intellectual like Amitav Ghosh, it's not a matter of resources, it's a matter of what COVID taught us all, that we might be isolated in our various places. And yet find moments and forms such as this can you imagine 3 years ago, we would not really know if you showed us a picture of the screen that we're looking at with all of these boxes and all of these places. This would be a form we didn't recognize very recently. And yet at the same time, as we might be in our places of isolation or chairs or black boxes with the screens turned off and just our name, all things we now know how to recognize and read and make judgments about. It's indexing, let's say. It's an index of the flows that bring Kerala, Berlin, New Orleans, and wherever else, Alabama, welcome to Alabama, whoever, that question, together at a moment, right? And so I'm really interested in those, to use friction, to use a Appadurai word, or disjunctures that at the same time index the circulatory matrix much larger, and our various forms of isolation, which is something that we worry about at the same time, right? For example, just to pick one example, the school teachers, at least here in the United States, I don't know if this is happening elsewhere, when after many schools kept younger children at home for a year or more, and these children who didn't yet have socially developed abilities to be, I'm talking about children 7, 8, 6 years old, who were forced to be on Zoom, for a year, let's say. When they came back to school, and we saw this at university students in the United States too, teachers started to notice they didn't know how to make eye contact. Because right now I'm actually looking at Arjun's face and right at his eyes, but because of the way the camera on my screen shows, you don't see me looking at, even if it was 2 people, we know this, right? So there's always, so children learn in school to look at you in the eye. Maybe they're shy and so on, but this is a very basic skill that is, one might say, somewhat human, and that the technology that brought us together at a moment when we couldn't circulate for health reasons changed as a social form, let's say. So there's so many things that we need to understand, and this is a very interdisciplinary topic, but I'm thinking about, the question is a very good one. I think in the post-COVID moment, isolation, lack of circulation will run alongside massive circulation. Anyway, that's my comment. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful, Brian. Maybe I'll just add a word on the 2 questions that our colleagues just asked. I don't have that screen open, but I know what the questions are, at least the parts that I can engage. One, the very big question of extractivism. I think it's not unconnected to Divya Kannan's question, which is that there is, as it were, a static side or a very coercive side, let's say, to processes that might otherwise be imagined as being simply horizons of possibility. So I think I would say my whole life has been about where are the flows and then where are the things that stop them, or the forces that make certain things move, like cricket, but other things not move. I mean, and that's because there are real issues that have to do with not merely passports, borders, polices, and so on, which we know tons about, but also various forms of selective attention, pre-conscious cultural censorship that doesn't receive one form well, receives another. I mean, this is very fascinating, very difficult and hard to kind of contain or resolve in any final way, because the phenomena are constantly unfolding before our eyes. But extractivism certainly is, to my mind, one of those words which is got an old history, extraction, exploitation, that is at least as old as monks. But the vism part of it, I think, indicates some kind of ideology or view, which, let's say, makes extraction normatively okay. That has become an extractivism. It's not just extraction with a structure. I think that's a big thing. And I'll just make one comment about it. I do think the entire history of the production of what Marx rightly and wisely called surplus value, both absolute and relative. And relative for him was crucial in the 3 volumes of Capital. Many people much wiser than I have written about that, but that is a story that we can see again and again, alas, And it doesn't cease to be true in our world, except, I would say, for the following things. One is I've written quite a bit in another avatar or guise or in another display of lack of discipline about finance, about banking, and about derivatives. So many of you know that finance capital now is at least half of the value of capital worldwide and represents truly unimaginable sums of money. It is abstract, but it's also created huge new inequalities, there's nothing fictive about how it works, but its mechanisms are not that easy to understand. And so that's the first place extraction is occurring, let's say, is through financial markets. The second thing I will say is that, and this is something I've written about, that in the history of the way small elites take advantage of very large parts of the population, the latest frontier is sociality itself as a mineable resource. So I don't think anymore it's, of course, coal, steel, iron, gas, and so on. Those are all important, of course. That's still all going on. Nor is it even precious metals and so on, which we know are the new frontier required for all our infrastructural world, especially digital world. But it is literally how you and I relate. This is being monetized at scales never before seen and multiplying before our eyes now. So my view is the most terrifying thing about the history of, let's just call it capitalism or whatever type, which is global and so on, is that we are now the key last resource to be mined, to be packaged, to be exploited, to be disaggregated so that we are eyeballs or fingers, so each sense is separated. There's a whole story there, but I think human sociality is the resource now being extracted on the most massive basis at the cutting edge. So even if you look around India, that's the story. Every venture capitalist in India is after that. Is not after, more toilets or clean running water. That's not the game. The other question was about cosmopolitanism, liberalism. There was a third word, which will come back to me in a minute. But my point is, the question is perfectly relevant and very deep, because it is a disjuncture in the sense that Brian was also commenting on, or some lack of fit. These things have become separate beasts. So you can be, first of all, quite cosmopolitan and thoroughly illiberal. So I'll take 80% of the Indian diaspora overseas, you might say is cosmopolitan, but they are surely illiberal. At the same time, you can go down the scale to, let's say, a part of the world like UP. Now, that's a state ruled by a guy which, if it's imaginable, is scarier than the Prime Minister, Yogi Adityanath. He's not a guy, and that's a Muslim, a huge Muslim population that he openly would like to see disappear. It's a terrifying thing, and he can say this, and he has said it, and he has done things to put it in place. And now, right now, as you know, this week there are things going on, not in Uttar Pradesh, but in Uttarakhand, a place where people of different religious faiths live together, but now a huge battle between Hindus and Muslims has been precipitated, created, foisted by the ruling party. So the lesson here is all these things, liberalism, cosmopolitanism, are, and the third word, which I can't now remember in your question, have indeed come apart. So you can no longer read one off the other. I mean, nobody can say Viktor Orban is not cosmopolitan. He's by his own advertisement illiberal. So all these things, basically, we need to analyze the ways in which they have come apart. And I would say, just throwing out a little observation, because perhaps Divya will tell us we may be running out of time, I think. The comment I have is that the whole so-called global swing to the right, which I believe is real and true, from Erdogan and Trump to Orban and Modi and on the list goes, in which Xi Jinping and Putin have been long members, is somehow not just old things coming to rise, Russian Empire, this, that. It's brilliant bricolage and recombination of what it means to be cosmopolitan. Your second word was global and liberal. So these things have all been put in the blender, squeezed and flipped around, and then thrown out as, yes, let's go get the Muslims. That's a very modern thing to do, isn't it? Or it's a very global thing. It has to do with India first. So if I object to that, I'm anti-Indian, and India is first. So you see the whole thing, the script has been rewritten, to use again an older metaphor. There's some. So I'll stop there just to say that it's a wonderful question and worthy of a lot of thought and attention.
Thank you for that. We have two final questions. One is from our own iShore chief, Dr. Vijay Verghese. And Verghese says, thank you very much for this illuminating talk, Professor Appadurai. I like the way in which you emphasize the idea of flows. Keeping your earlier formulation of global ethnoscapes in mind and the idea of friction that you highlighted today, how would you factor the flows of diverse particularisms? What is, in my mind, is the particularist visions that diasporas have for their respective homes, for instance? So something that you just briefly touched upon. So that's Verghese's question. And finally, we have Mahmood's question, more like invitation to a broader discussion, which is such an insightful lecture by Arjun and a thought-provoking discussion from Brian by bringing diverse topics into conversation, from New Orleans to Mumbai, US and Iran cinema, to port cities, temples, and English factories. Extremely grateful. My somewhat broad question is, when we learn and relearn things, as Arjun suggested, and put different disciplines into conversation, would we see more of contradictions than harmonies? For example, how would you conceptualize if you were to put temples in the ocean or an ocean into modernity vis-a-vis chronological divisions, such as longue durée of the oceans? So two very broad questions. So we will try to wrap up by in the next 15 minutes. So you have 5 minutes to respond to both of them.
I'll be brief because they are indeed very broad questions and very important ones. One is I have been doing some writing on this swing to the right, to what you may call authoritarian, autocratic, anti-democratic. The terms vary, but we know what we are talking about, which is not everywhere, but is certainly in many, many places. So lots of people are struggling with this elephant. Some are pulling the tail, some are pulling the trunk. I'm one of those running from the tail to the trunk to the legs, trying to understand what is this about. But one of the things it's about is, in fact, the exportability of particularism. So I'm living in Germany. There's a huge Turkish population here. At least 50% of them have Erdogan flags, this party, this, that. So here it is. So this is a population living in Western Europe, but Turkey is very close by, and that's itself a deep story, which, by the way, is mostly a land story because it's an Ottoman story. There's hard to see much ocean there, but doubtless the ocean will be brought in by Mahmood or some other friends of us, or Divya herself. We will know why the Ottoman should be seen in oceanic perspective. But at the moment, it looks like a land issue with a very long, tortured history, which affects Hungary, which affects Austria, and which affects Germany. So the proximity to Istanbul, for example, from here, to me is always a surprise, because when I was in New York in the US, it was far away. Well, it's not far away now. So in that light, just let me say that I think there's some general processes going on here. One is that just as in the world of digital media, one of our questions is, one of my puzzles is, all this flow of information should make people more understanding of each other. It seems to be multiplying exactly the opposite. Hate multiplies, this multiplies, that multiplies. So it's like Gresham's law with coins. Bad news drives out good news. Bad messages drive out good news. It seems to be a law, but who made this law? It's not clearly obvious physics. It's something else, and it's not easy to understand. And you cannot even understand it by saying, Adani just bought this, or Ravish Kumar lost his job. You can say that here and there, but you can't say it worldwide that somebody is telling the media what to do. The audience is also there. They are buying and they are producing their own stuff. Videos are being made on the bazaar in the street of terrible things and circulated. So it's not just being done by big media. So there is some puzzle there. And I would say that is the puzzle also of the diasporic receptivity to particularist messages. And that is a very complex story, which has many, many aspects to it. But I think I cannot resist saying here, advertising my secret theological dogma, which I have stayed away from up to this point, but I must now unveil that the Trinity, which is actually a single thought, that the root, I say this only half humorously, the root of all the evils of the last 3 centuries is the nation state. So this can be like a debate.
Would you like to respond to Mahmood?
Yes, sorry, I heard something going on, some interruption. So just to say, I will respond to Mahmood, but I was saying that the problem is all around these particularistic flows. There is a general problem, which is the nation state both seeks to export itself and to hold on to something very local. It's a deep structural tension in the design of our modern world, and it explains a lot of things. But on Mahmood's point, all I can say is thank you very much for your general endorsement of the range of the subjects that came up. And here is a very quick thought. That is, I think there is nothing to lose in multiplying these things, as some very wise reader of Marx said, let us deepen the contradictions. In other words, there's no point trying to create harmony. Samjhauta Express has never served scholarship well. So let new angles, new positions, unsettle either the landed things or the older things by newer things, or the newer things by older things. So whatever may be the case, I have never seen a downside when more troubling, unsettling things arise. There's always a gain. So that's my in principle answer. Of course, not all diversity is welcome, because some diversities are truly intolerant or repressive. But barring that, I think we have nothing to lose by letting these points of view multiply.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Appadurai, for patiently engaging with the audience. A lot of food for thought. I was also thinking about the role of technology when you said with all this fake news and WhatsApp groups that it's difficult to sieve the truth from a lot of this information. I will hand over to Dr. Abdul Wahid of MES Mampad College to share the vote of thanks. But before that, on behalf of iSure, we thank all of you for being here. We have received an absolutely wonderful response. And again, our next speaker will be on July 28th. We have the Hungarian scholar, Professor István Purcell from the Central European University, who will talk about Eastern Syrian and Syriac traditions between Iran, Southern India, and Europe in the 17th to 20th century. So bringing in more regions and questions of other oceanic bodies in the other part of the world. So I end my role there, and I hand over to Dr. Wahid to share a few words.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Okay. It has been a great opportunity for our students to spend a couple of hours with great intellectuals like these great people. And it has been a great honor for our college, MES Mampad College. In fact, it is in Malabar, the first of its kind in the district. And this time has been very invaluable for us, for my students who have been spending their time in graduation in different departments, being from English, economics, Arabic, Islamic history, and political science. So this time has been memorable for them in their life. And I'm sure that they will be keeping connected with our honorable guest and their online content they have produced earlier. And this opportunity, I would like to extend my extreme gratitude to all the dignitaries who have been making their great lectures here. And I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of iShore, a young, energetic, and ebullient bunch of scholars who have been enthusiastically participating, organizing, and spending time in academic lectures and presentations like this. And this is my time to extend my gratitude to the Honorable Chief Guest of the Day, Professor Arjun Appadurai, who is originally an Indian, and I believe that he has a Tamil link. And we are very proud of him having a very great academic life and career. And I would like to extend my gratitude to Honorable Professor Arjun Appadurai, sir, for a great lecture and your wonderful presence with us. And it has been inspiring for our students. And secondly, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Brian T. Edwards, Dean and Professor from School of Liberal Arts from Tulane University, USA. And it has been a great honor for our students, especially we have students from literature background also. And your words were greatly inspiring and interesting and insightful for us. And I would like to express my gratitude to the moderator, Divya Kannan, who is also from India, from Shiv Nadar University. And your comments, your participation, and of course, your management of this session was very interesting, and you have made this session wonderful. And I would like to express my gratitude to you also. And at last but not least, I would like to extend my gratitude to my dear friend, Mr. Mahmood, who made this collaboration a reality. And I pray that he will have a wonderful career ahead, being a very young and energetic and promising academic from our Malabar place. And finally, I would like to extend my gratitude to all the participants online. I can see there are many great personalities online listening to these lectures for these couple of hours. I take this opportunity as a great honor to extend my gratitude to all of you and all my students and all the participants who have been keeping with us for these last 2 hours. And thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wahid, for your generous comments. I am going to compel Dr. Edwards to pitch in with a few words before we log out. Yeah, thank you all. We do look forward to seeing you in the future. Over to you, Edward.
Well, thank you. First of all, my thanks. I will repeat all of that. I'm so pleased to meet you all. The only thing I will end to say that's new is that this would typically be the moment when we break into little groups and have something to drink and nibble on and chat with each other and have the fun part of the social life of things, right? Dr. Appadurai. So I'm sorry that we cannot do that, but I'm very happy because when we started, someone's reminded me, I guess it was you, Divya, that it's Friday evening in Kerala. So I hope you have a wonderful Friday. Those of us who it's still not quite breakfast time have a day's work ahead of us. But I hope for all of you where it's Friday evening and the weekend, we'll have a wonderful weekend. And I really do hope to actually visit Mampad College, MES, and to see you there or in some other digital or real life configuration. I look forward to that. Arjun, I look forward to welcoming you to New Orleans too, since you made some references to that. We need to bring you here. But anyway, thanks to all. And again, I hope to engage with this wonderful research group. iShore, you're doing really important, exciting work on the oceanic studies. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And good night and good morning to all of you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.